Hello, welcome now to our fifth video for period 7, 1890 to 1945. Here we'll cover the key concepts for the Great Depression and the New Deal, along with some other outside information that will go along with these concepts. Of course, those students in my class know that we will look at some very specific things in class, but this is a nice overview for this time period, the Great Depression and the New Deal. As always remember that I put a focus question now for these various videos that I do. Progressivism. So we know that this was a major theme of period 7. We talked about Theodore Roosevelt through William Howard Taft and of course with Woodrow Wilson. But now we're going to see progressivism as it will explode during the New Deal. As always, we think of how it is both democratic in aspects, but at times also it seems anti-democratic as well. So let's get into this lesson. Well, we'll have to start at 7.1, Roman numeral 1. 7.1 tells us there was this growth and expanding opportunity in America. Of course, that is our contextualization point. So we're coming out of the Industrial Revolution, the height of capitalism. Remember, a good way to contextualize is to think of a continuity and a change. What was going on before as you go into a time period and perhaps what is about to change now. That is a good way to contextualize. And this particular key concept really helps us with that. We know in period 6, Gilded Age, Industrial Revolution, so this great capitalist expanding market that we had. But it also brought a lot of instability. We talked about various panics. Panic of 1873, which became the crime of 73. 20 years later, the Panic of 1893, which led to the election of 1896, and that great children's story book we talked about, The Wizard of Oz. Now we go into the 20th century. Here in 7.1, Roman numeral 1, letter C, it talks about episodes of credit and market instability is constantly going on even in the early 20th century. There's actually a panic of 1907, sometimes referred to as the Roosevelt panic. That would be Theodore Roosevelt. A few years later, 22 years later actually, there will be this massive Great Depression. That's only going to fuel individuals, especially liberal progressives, to want to see even more financial regulatory systems when it comes to banking. Now I'm going to ask you a question here. How did Woodrow Wilson already begin to regulate the financial system? I'll wait a few moments for you to think about it. I'm going to take a little sip of my water. See, tonight, and it's night for me, it's nighttime. I'm going to take a little sip of water. I'm going to take a little break here. Got to stay hydrated, folks. Got to stay hydrated. Are you still thinking about it? How did Woodrow Wilson regulate the financial system? You know what? I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to look in your notes. I'm going to see if you can put that in your notes. Because Woodrow Wilson begins this, how does government and banks get a little bit closer to each other, as it were? So this regulatory system is put into place. However, as America comes out of World War I, anytime you come out of a major war, we get, in essence, what some people might refer to, and I often think of it as a false economy. Right? There's a lot of industrial growth that takes place during a war. People can see that and think that that means things are going to go on forever. We go into the 1920s, a very now prosperous decade, the 1920s. That was my last video. We have popular cultures exploding, radio and movies. People are now investing in the stock market, or we call speculation. Guessing, basically. We're buying stocks like never before. It used to be only the rich people who invested in the stock market. Now the middle class and the lower upper class, these are individuals who are now doing it, and they're thinking they're going to get rich quick. But these are shaky banking policies. Some of the stocks are inflated stocks. And you might remember back during the Gilded Age, we talked about Credit Mobilier, this fake construction company that was supposed to be building railroad tracks, and they had stock, and people bought stock in this company. They inflated the prices. You would buy stock for, let's say, $1 a share. And then all of a sudden you thought that was a real company, really helping the Pacific Railroad Company to build a railroad. And so the stocks would go up to $5 a share, $10 a share, $30, $50, $100 a share. Well, that's inflated. We just keep pumping up the price of stock. And it turned out that was a fake construction company and helped to lead to the Panic of 1873. Same thing is happening here. A lot of companies now are inflating their stocks because everyday people are buying stocks. And the banks, even though there's supposed to be a system to help stop them, there really isn't any law yet to stop them from doing this. They're going to merge with Wall Street because they're going to see an opportunity for themselves to get rich. They're going to allow people to buy stock in what's called buying on credit. In other words, you can't afford to buy into Coca-Cola. You can't afford to buy into IBM or any of the other businesses of the time, perhaps commodities. So the bank will let you buy on credit. In this time period, they would actually allow you to only put about 10% of the price of the stock down. The bank would come up with the other 90%. So you buy something, and let's say you want to buy 500 shares, and I'll say Coca-Cola just because it's something you understand. And 500 shares, and let's say Coca-Cola is selling at $5 a share. Well, that would be $2,500 you would have to come up with in, let's say, 1922. That's a lot of money. That's more than a couple of years worth of salary. So the bank will tell you, all right, you only put down 10% of the $2,500, which is $250. That's a little bit easier for you. The bank will come up with the other 90%. Once the stock rises, even though you only put in $250, you will still make money on what you paid, and the bank will make money on what they put in. What the bank did not have to tell you, and they didn't tell you, was this thing called call on margin. In other words, if something went wrong with the stock, they could now come to you and tell you to give us the other 90%. You don't have it? In that time period, they could go after your assets. They could go after your bank accounts, your saving account. They could go after your house if they wanted to. But they didn't have to tell you about the call on margin aspect of buying on credit. This is going on through the 1920s. You can see where this is a problem. Let's go to agriculture. World War I, agriculture greatly benefits. The United States starts to feed the world as they're at war, especially Europe. Agricultural prices shoot up. Farmers are making good money. The war comes to an end. In America, there's still this belief that farming agriculture prices are still going to go up. Europe was destroyed basically. There's no way they're going to be able to produce. Well, they do begin to produce. But the United States is still overproducing corn and wheat and potatoes and tomatoes and cucumbers and giant pumpkins. I don't know why giant pumpkins, but that's what we do in America. So we have overproduction, but now there's underconsumption. So we have a surplus begins to happen. Europe doesn't want to buy all of our product anymore. Prices begin to plummet. No one's really paying attention to this. The 1920s was this great decade, supposedly. We had Calvin Coolidge. We talked a little bit about him in the last video. Keep cool with Coolidge. He wins his election in 1924. Prosperity is just everywhere you can imagine. Herbert Hoover then runs in 1928, our third Republican president of the 1920s. Coolidge could have ran again in 1928, but he chose not to. Turned out to be a good thing because he will die a little bit later on. But anyways, Hoover was a very popular guy. during World War I, Hoover was the guy that helped to organize a relief effort for the starving people of Belgium. And he became very popular for that. When Warren G. Harding became president, he put him in the cabinet position, and he stayed in a cabinet position for Coolidge. So Americans really liked this guy, Hoover. Hoover had a degree in engineering from a little school you might have heard of called Stanford. Americans really thought this is the decade of business, right? Calvin Coolidge said the business of America is business. This is a business-minded guy, Herbert Hoover. Let's keep him in the office. Let's keep good times rolling. Now, some people claim that Hoover claimed there'd be a chicken in every pot. That's an old expression. He actually never said it. Somebody else said it, but it always gets attributed to him. The problem is, you win your election in November of 28. He takes his oath of office in his inaugural address in March of 29, and he talks about we're at the time of basically a golden age in America. Within just a few months, October 1929, the 29th of 1929, Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed. But we talk about that as like this fixed date in history, 10/29/29. A few weeks earlier, the stock market was already in flux. There were already signs that there were some problems. Buying on credit is a problem. Overproduction is a problem. All of a sudden, building of skyscrapers begins to slow down. Building of homes in America begins to slow down. People should have paid attention to this, but they often don't. Stock market's already in flux, and then, bam, it bottoms out. Dysentery everywhere. This is a picture of Wall Street on the day that this happens. Thousands of office workers are just flooding the street here in Wall Street. People lost fortunes. There were millionaires that woke up one day, and by the end of the day or within a couple of days were no longer millionaires. Within 3 weeks, $30 billion in value of securities, of stocks, of bonds, of loans. Like breath on a mirror, disappear. Just gone. Within a few weeks later, another $30 billion gone. Now, most Americans did not invest in the stock market, so they didn't really see why this was such a big deal until about 1930, when they began to realize with companies that invested and companies begin to lose money, that meant jobs. And then people get laid off. And when you get laid off, you start to burn through your savings. And then everybody's in a mess. Millions and millions of Americans begin to lose their jobs, begin to lose their savings, begin to lose their homes. And everyone begins to blame Hoover for all of this. Which always begs the question. He is known as the do-nothing president, but was he truly a do-nothing president? Thousands of people begin to live in what's called a shantytown. Makeshift, cardboard, plywood little homes. They find these big fields. One of the biggest shanty towns will be outside of Washington, D.C. They'll call it Hooverville. His name becomes a punchline to a lot of various jokes. When you have a cardboard house, that's somebody who's living in poverty. When you have several of them, that's a Hooverville. A Hoover flag is when you take your pockets and you turn it outside and your outside pocket is hanging out. That becomes a Hoover flag. Everyone begins to blame him for everything. Now, true, he's a laissez-faire, hands-off economics president. But if you think about it, did he have an example to look back on? The Panic of 1819 with James Monroe, 1837, Martin Van Buren, 1857 with James Buchanan, the Panic of 1873, Ulysses S. Grant, 1893, Grover Cleveland, 1907, Theodore Roosevelt. Was there an example he could look at of a president who was actually very proactive with the economy? Not really. Like all those presidents, they might do a couple of things here or there, but for the most part, they felt the economy would just fix itself, and generally it did. But it turns out Hoover was a little bit more active than people often give him credit for. He cuts taxes. He increases spending on public work programs. We mentioned this once in class before. A public work program is where the government creates jobs to help put people to work. With him, it was building roads, there was some hospitals built, some schools were built. Sometimes people think of the Hoover Dam. Let's be clear on the Hoover Dam. The Hoover Dam was actually the Boulder Dam project, a project that was commissioned by Congress before Hoover was even president, signed into law by Calvin Coolidge. But they began construction of the Hoover Dam in 1931 while Herbert Hoover is president. And yes, he did think this would help jumpstart the economy, but it was still called the Boulder Dam. When construction began, the Secretary of the Interior had gone out there and he gave a speech and he officially called it the Hoover Dam because Hoover was president. When FDR becomes president and a Democratic Congress takes over, they don't want to call this the Hoover Dam at all. They always want to blame Hoover for everything. But in 1947, I believe, they officially changed the name to the Hoover Dam. But again, it wasn't a program that he had initially thought of. Like I said, the act was actually passed when Coolidge was president, but construction did begin while he was president, and he did think that this would help jumpstart the economy. He will always reject the idea of direct relief from government. Again, he's a conservative Republican. He doesn't believe that the government should just dole out subsidies and money and things like that for people, but he does believe that through voluntary organizations, people could start to help each other and the government can allow that to happen. He did pass the 1932 Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC, not the KFC. We're not talking about Kentucky Fried Chicken here. We're talking about the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, giving emergency loans to banks and businesses. Now, some people might think, oh, of course, you're going to help the rich. Well, think about it. If I protect the bank, I protect your savings. If I protect business, I protect your jobs. Now, while this was it wasn't enough, obviously, to help the Great Depression, but it did allow for a mechanism of government that when Franklin Delano Roosevelt becomes president, he's going to be able to utilize what Hoover already did to expand upon that with his New Deal. Something he will never give credit to Hoover for, and the Democrats of that time period will never give credit to Hoover. Again, I'm not saying that Hoover was a great president, not a great president at all, especially in speeches. The guy was very monotone. He wore these giant collars on his shirt, very stiff, so he gave the appearance of a guy who was just aloof or, above the average American. So he didn't do good. He didn't do well enough for his own image. But still, he did try to do some things. But in the midst of this, Congress, a Republican Congress at the time, decided to raise tariffs to an unsightly amount, the Hawley-Smoot tariff of 1930. Industry believes that it's going to suffer when Europe, Asia, and other parts of the world perhaps begin to flood our markets with cheaper made products. So they raise these massive barriers, this giant wall of a tariff, this tax on imported goods to protect American industry. I understand why they probably felt they had to do it. However, when you raise your tariffs, the world in turn reciprocates and raises their tariffs. In essence, this became a declaration of economic war against the world. It actually hurt the world when it came to the Depression worldwide. Trade basically comes to a halt. So for that, these are the reasons why people began to look at Hoover as a do-nothing president and someone who actually worsened the Great Depression to some aspects. The other thing is, there's something that's going to happen that's really going to hurt Hoover's reputation. I want to talk to you about this. This is where this video is going to go a little longer, so I apologize for that. I'm going to pause again here. I want to hydrate myself. You might want to pause right now. Nothing like good filtered water. I'm telling you right now. All right, so let's talk about the bonus army. All right, so when Calvin Coolidge was president, all right, they passed this World War Adjusted Compensation Act. Members of the, well, let's say the United States Army wanted to get some kind of pension for fighting in World War I. Again, they didn't call it World War I, called it the Great War, but it was a world war. The last time veterans got pensions from a war was the Civil War. In the Spanish-American War, there was no pensions for that. That was a 3 months, was it April, May, June, July, August, 4 months. That war lasted 4 months, so they did not really give pensions for those veterans. Well, these veterans wanted pensions. That war came to an end in 1918. So a lot of back and forth over the preceding years. When Calvin Coolidge is president, Congress finally passes this World War Adjusted Compensation Act. They would get a bonus, a pension in 1945. By the way, Calvin Coolidge vetoed this act. He vetoed it. That was in my last video, and I actually wrote voted, remember? And I said, oh, it wasn't he voted, he vetoed it. Just in case you forgot that mistake. Congress overrode the veto. So they're supposed to get their bonus in 1945. Well, surprise, the Great Depression, yay! And when Hoover gives this bonuses to banks and businesses, as we just talked about in the RFC, remember, not the KFC, the RFC, these veterans want their bonus and they want it now. Walter Waters, a former sergeant of the U.S. Army, becomes his leading vocal voice in Seattle, Washington, and begins to start like this populist movement of veterans who want what they want now. They want their bonuses. And they literally march on to Washington. What started as a few hundred grow to thousands. It's hard to truly give a true count of how many. We're talking anywhere, depending on what resource or who's writing about this, anywhere from 20,000 to upwards of 50 to 60,000 people descend upon Washington, D.C. Just across the river, the Anacostia River, they build a massive shanty town, cardboard, plywood. They call it Hooverville, USA. And they will sit there, as you see here in the picture. They sit on the Capitol building. That's their great rotunda. You've got, I'm going to guess that's probably the House of Representatives, and on the other side is the Senate. They sit there every day, thousands and thousands of these men. They're giving speeches. They want their money now. What is starting to happen, though, is within this group of men, the majority of them legitimate veterans of World War I, some anarchists, communist elements are coming in here. Some people are riling up the group. What's to prevent them from literally, in actuality, walking into the Capitol building, there's thousands of them, and taking Congress hostage? There becomes this great fear in America that our government might be overthrown by this uprising of World War I veterans who are being perhaps influenced by more radical elements. Well, the House gets very, very nervous over this. On June 15th, 1932, the House of Representatives passed what's called the Wright-Patman Bill. Let's give them their money, give it to them now, so they'll go home. 2 days later in the Senate, they vote it down. They're not going to give money to people, especially if they believe they're being influenced by radical individuals. And then violence begins to break out. A lot of violence. First, the Washington, D.C. police try to move them off the Capitol steps. that turns into a horrible situation. Several police officers will be stabbed. Several of the bystanders will be hurt as well. The Washington, D.C. police will let the government know there's no way they can handle this. So Hoover calls out the United States Army under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. Now, Douglas MacArthur is a guy we're going to talk about a few times in our history. He'll come in, and he's under direct orders by the President of the United States. Remember, the President of the United States is Commander-in-Chief of all armed forces in peacetime and wartime. His order is to move them back across the Anacostia River, but do not attack Hooverville. This army moves in from different directions. By the way, in Douglas's army are a couple of captains. George Patton is here, who becomes a famous tank commander of World War II, but another captain by the name of Dwight D. Eisenhower. You might have heard of Eisenhower. He eventually becomes the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe during World War II, the architect of D-Day, and, oh, by the way, a President of the United States himself later on. He's in this army. Dwight Eisenhower did not approve of the things that Douglas MacArthur was doing. MacArthur decided not only to move them back across the Anacostia River, but against orders, he attacks Hooverville. He tear gases it. But the tear gas is explodable. And this is cardboard and plywood, and you set fire. They set fire to Hooverville. To this day, it's very controversial. How many people were hurt? How many people died? Rumors and reports all get blurred into one. Perhaps a baby died here from inhaling the fumes of tear gas. The official record is only a few people were hurt, injured, or killed. We do know the federal government put a censor on all hospitals within all the way to Baltimore, Maryland, by the way, that they could not report if anyone came in there claiming they were hurt from this incident because they were afraid that communists and anarchists would lie. Some historians think maybe close to 100 people may have actually died. But again, there's no way to prove that. We know this is a terrible, terrible moment in U.S. history. FDR is now running for president as the Democratic nominee for 1932. He's having breakfast when he reads in the newspaper of the Bonus Army incident, and he will tell an aide, "This gets me elected." And he was right. People began to see this, and even people who might have thought, we'll keep the conservatives in office after this terrible incident, a lot of people begin to think, well, maybe Hoover isn't the right guy to try to do this. Too much violence is starting to happen. By the way, Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. I'm going to ask you in your notes to write that down, look it up, and tell me, how does this affect what took place in the Bonus Army? Posse Comitatus Act, 1878. To give you a hint, the Reconstruction has come to an end when this law was passed. You might want to think about who specifically wanted a Posse Comitatus Act in 1878. You don't know what I mean yet because you haven't looked it up yet, but by the time we're done with this, you will know. So the future is the past, and the past is the present, and my brain hurts! All right, I'm moving on. Oh, here we go.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to...
Thank you, FDR. Always love that speech. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. I don't know what that necessarily means, but it's really a pretty awesome moment in a speech. 1932. Americans have no idea of the health status of Franklin Roosevelt. We'll talk about this in class. Polio, right? Some of you know this. Did he have polio? Did he not have polio? Did he only have a little bit of polio? Is there such a thing as a little bit of polio? It was a very confusing thing for a lot of Americans. But in essence, they elected an individual who basically lived his life in a wheelchair. You often wonder, here in 2020, could Americans look at someone who's handicapped and see them for the person they truly are? See them for the human being they really, truly are. We are so visual conscious today that we often don't understand that a human being is more than a sum of just their physical parts. And that's what FDR was. He was able to get Americans not to think about any physical handicaps, but who he was as a person. Here we are now back at 7-1, now Roman numeral 3. So we are in the Great Depression. Policymakers have to decide, what are they going to do about mass unemployment? What are they going to do about social upheavals that are happening? Social upheavals, the bonus army event, by the way, of the Great Depression. They want to transform the United States into a limited welfare state. So that's right there in our concepts. Welfare, where the United States government begins to help more and more people. The goals and ideas of what they felt now is modern liberalism. This is progressivism. Progressivism, liberalism marry each other. Franklin Roosevelt now becomes one of our presidents mentioned by name in the key concepts. Right? You've got Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. Then it's Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln. Then we go all the way to Woodrow Wilson. Now Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We have 2 more to go. There's only 10 mentioned by name. Won't tell you who they are yet. Actually, in class I did, but anyways, you probably know. I want you to remember this. When it comes to this idea of the New Deal, the New Deal is simply the name given to his domestic policy. I know 16, 17-year-olds, they have a hard time conceptualizing the idea of the name of a policy and actually what policies are. So these are programs that will be developed to help Americans during the Great Depression, some of which are still with us to this day, known collectively as the New Deal. But they're also divided into 3 R's. Always remember that, because here it is in the concepts. There's always the 3 R's of the New Deal. You could very well, on your AP exam, either multiple choice, short answers, DBQ, long essay, have to express the idea that the New Deal is divided into 3 R's. Relief, recovery, reform. Relief is always something immediate, something you're going to just throw out millions of dollars trying to get people working within a 3 to 6 month period of time, and that's all it is. Recovery always looks at the economy. How can we recover certain aspects of the economy? Now you're thinking, well, what does that mean? Well, agriculture is an aspect of the economy. Industry is an aspect of the economy. Trade is an aspect of the economy. So how do we recover the American recovery? Reform, how can government change certain aspects so that these things don't happen again? So the 3 R's are both short range and long range in nature, and they also kind of interact with each other. You can't always say that it's 100% relief, recovery, reform, but it's pretty doggone close when we come to these. They're also known as the alphabet soup, because FDR loved acronyms. And there are dozens and dozens of them. Do you have to know all of them? I'm stopping to take a little drink here. Do you have to know all of them? Not necessarily. But you do have to know a few of them. And we'll go over some of them here, and I'll go over some of them in class as well. One of the first things he does. Now, if you remember back to our earlier concept, it talked about regulating the financial system. And I asked you, how did Woodrow Wilson regulate the financial system? See, now I'm telling it to you twice. So you got to tell me how he did that. Well, now here's how Roosevelt will start on it. March 6th, he gives his inaugural address, and just a few days later, March 6th through March 10th, he initiates what's called a national bank holiday. All banks in America are officially closed. No one's allowed to bank. That way, the government can look at every bank and decide what banks are salient, what banks are actually strong enough to continue, what banks are weak, what banks might need a little help. Weak banks are closed permanently. The other banks will reopen them, and the government will really have oversight on what they do. This is the beginning of what's known as the 100 Days Congress. From March 9th through June 16th, 1933, so much legislation will be passed in that basically 100-day period of time. It's some of the fastest laws ever given out. Government usually moves at the speed of mud. Let me reiterate. Government often moves at the speed of mud. Here, he got it to move at the speed of mud, but in a landslide kind of a way. A lot of stuff is going to be done, but some problems. We also call this the blank check. Congress will allow FDR to basically create law. Tell us what laws you want. We'll rubber stamp it, as it were. It's sort of like your dad gives you a check and tells you, fill in any amount you want. What are you going to do? I mean, seriously. So government tells Roosevelt, here's a blank check. Tell us whatever laws you want, and we'll just make it happen. That's going to be a problem later on for Roosevelt because the Supreme Court is going to get involved. Well, let's talk about some other things here. Staying here in 7-3A, Roosevelt these fireside chats, right? He would go on the radio in a very calming way and try to help Americans understand that everything's going to go okay. In the wintertime, you'd see the Christmas tree there, but there'd be a fireplace going in the back. And on the radio, you could hear the crackling of the fire, the embers burning. And so you would know, the fireside chat. Here in 2020, when people talk about fireside chats, again, you've never probably heard of them, but a lot of people think that maybe he gave them once a week or, a couple times a month. He only gave a few of them in the entire time he was president, but they became very popular. But sticking with this idea of regulating financial institutions, this massive law gets passed, Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. The government now has more regulation on banks, and they create the Federal Deposit Insurance Commission, FDIC. Part of the alphabet soup. Do you have to remember that one? Yeah, that one I'm going to make you remember, because that's one that's still with us to this day. If any of you have a savings account or even a checking account with a bank, and I know nobody ever actually goes to a physical bank anymore, but if you ever did, you would see a gold sticker in the window that says FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Commission. When we put our money in a bank, it's now insured by the federal government. With Roosevelt's time period, it was up to about $5,000. In our time period, I believe it's around $250,000 is insured in the banks by the federal government. In case there's ever a big time crash again, you won't necessarily lose your life savings. One of those legacies now of the New Deal. He's going to order all private ownership of gold to be surrendered. No more gold. He officially takes the United States off of the gold standard and replace only with paper dollars. He called this his managed currency. Inflationary policy. If you go back to the Populist Party, that's kind of what he's doing here. This will relieve debtors. He increases the price of gold in the United States from $21 to $35 an ounce. We returned to a gold standard in 1934, but notice I highlighted here for trade purposes only. The United States people weren't allowed to buy things in gold anymore. Now you might wonder, what did he do with all that gold? Everyone's turning in their gold coin. Well, he melted it down. Well, he didn't do it personally. Don't think Roosevelt's out there, pulling levers and smelting gold. He sent it to the gold smelter people. I don't know. And they turned it into gold bullion bars, right? Gold bars. And then they went to a fort in Kentucky that was already there called Fort Knox, which has a lot of property. And on the property, they dug this massive underground vault. And that's where they put the gold. So you might have heard of Fort Knox. It's at this time period where all the gold goes to Fort Knox. He also institutes a whole new economic system for America. Up until now, we lived in the capitalist, purely capitalist world of Adam Smith, and capitalism, laissez-faire, hands-off, to John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes is an English economist who was alive at the time period, and he always talked about what we call demand-side economics, where government has to be a major player in the economy. And the New Deal is based a lot upon Keynesian economics. By the way, John Maynard Keynes is the only economist that has a branch of economics actually named after him. Hopefully next year in your AP Microeconomics, you'll learn a little bit more about Keynesian economics. It is basically the economics of the world for much of the country, for much of the world today. Even today, there's a lot of Keynesian economics that's still practiced. The United States does kind of a mixed, I don't want to get into economic policies, but Keynesian economics is still there. There's also, a lot of capitalism as well, but it is basically here to stay. And we'll talk a lot about Keynesian economics actually when we talk about World War II. I want to talk to you again about some of this alphabet soup. Here's some that you are going to need to know. The CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. He's going to take young men, 18 to 24, and put them to work in the National Forestry. We're talking millions of young men put to work. They're going to put out forest fires. They're going to clean roadsides. They're going to cut down trees. They're going to dig ditches. They're going to bring irrigation out to the west. Now, what was the purpose of this? Well, it put a lot of young men to work, but they had to take a portion of their paycheck and send it back home to their families. Oftentimes, dad could not find a job because of the Great Depression. Well, your son or sons went off to work in the CCC, and they were sending money back home to you so that you can keep your home, right? So you can help pay the mortgage, help pay a car payment. That was the purpose of this. It was very much like being in the military. And a lot of people often were angry over this because it felt like you were training young men to get them ready to be in the military. And then, World War II begins in 1939. I don't know, I'm just saying. It's what a coinkydink, by the way, huh? The Federal Emergency Relief Act, we'll talk about that in class. The AAA, Agriculture Adjustment Act. We talked about overproduction, underconsumption. We had a massive surplus of wheat, corn, and various other agricultural products. Milk as well. Roosevelt wants to eat down the surplus. How do you do that? Well, you're going to pay the farmers to stop growing. Follow me on this? You're going to pay farmers basically to stop growing. That way the surplus can be used. This is one of the things that's going to come under the watchful eye of the Supreme Court, by the way. You're taking taxpayer dollars and you're giving it to people not to work. Some people didn't like this, and the Supreme Court is going to eventually get involved with the AAA. Homeowners Loans Corporation. This is an important one because it brings us the FHA, the Federal Housing Act, which I don't have that up here, but FHA. That's still with us today as well. If you're a new-time home buyer, you might want to ask your parents. They probably bought their house with an FHA loan, Federal Housing Administration or Federal Housing Act, which came under this Homeowners Loan Corporation. Still one of the great legacies of the New Deal. We still use it. CWA, the Civil Works Administration. Again, this was part of the relief effort, putting people to work immediately and often temporary was the Civil Works Administration. Building a hospital, building a school, building a section of a road or a highway. It would last 3 months, 6 months, 7 months, and then it was over. But it was a massive one of the programs of the New Deal. Again, only a few of the dozens that there are going to be. Getting to letter B, not everyone's happy with Roosevelt. There's radical individuals, there's union individuals, and populists who felt that Roosevelt wasn't too left enough, that he didn't do enough. One of them was the senator from Louisiana, Huey Long, known as the Kingfish. He preached share our wealth programs. He wanted rich people in America to give every person in America who wasn't rich $5,000 a year. Share our wealth. Does this sound familiar, by the way, in 2020? Telling the rich, the multimillionaires, the billionaires, give some of your money to the poor? Think about that for a second. He gets assassinated August 10th, 1935. Is it because of this particular thing? Don't know. He started off as a huge supporter of FDR, but eventually he turned further and further to the left, more to socialism. There's a lot of controversies in the state of Louisiana with him, and he is shot outside of his office. But he was a very controversial figure at the time and a very popular figure at the time, Huey Long. Francis Townshend was a radio personality who began to preach old age pension plans, that when you get to a certain age and you're going to be forced to retire, the federal government should be paying you a pension. Well, this thing, FDR eventually will listen to, and this becomes our Social Security Act. Then there's Father Charles Coughlin. Not going to say a lot about Father Charles Coughlin here in this video. I'm going to talk about him in class. Let's just say an interesting character. World War II. I'll just leave it at that. We're going to go on. We're going to talk about this in class as well. This is the continuation of letter B. Here the Supreme Court seeks to limit the New Deal. You begin to see some of the things that Congress has allowed. That blank check is unconstitutional. The Constitution says only Congress can create law, not the president. This becomes a massive issue when it comes to a couple of the various acts, one of which I did not mention here. I'm going to talk about very specifically in class later on. In 1936, FDR wins in a massive landslide. He wins 526 electoral votes to 8. To 8. This poor Alfred Landon. He believes the United States people have given him a mandate, that they want him to pursue the New Deal at all costs. He knows the Supreme Court is upset with him, so he's going to get in this thing we call the court packing scheme. He's going to try to take over the Supreme Court. That's something else we're going to do very specifically in class. There's a reading we're going to do. This is not going to bode well for FDR. His popularity is skyrocketing in 1936. In 1937, when he actually starts to make a move against the Supreme Court, he wants to replace the judges with all New Dealers. He wants to appoint more judges that are all New Dealer judges. This seemed like being a dictator. And by now, Adolf Hitler is a dictator. So there are people in America that do not like that FDR is seemingly imitating somebody like Hitler. And his popularity is going to take a hit. If it wasn't for World War II finally happening, who knows what the legacy of FDR would have been. He would have been a 2-term president, not a 4-term, which is what he's going to become because of World War II. But this court packing scheme is going to be a big, big deal. And I want to cover that more specifically in class. I'm going to end it here with the legacy of the New Deal. Again, a lot of the New Deal is still with us. The FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Commission, still with us. The Federal Housing Administration is still with us. And obviously, Social Security Act of 1935 is one of the biggest legacies of the New Deal. It did realign political, the ideology for African Americans. By this time, African Americans began to fully shift to the Democratic Party. They began slowly with Woodrow Wilson, but by the 1930s, pretty much the great majority of African Americans, though many of them are still Republicans to this day, began to realign themselves with the Democratic Party. Also, the working class began to see the Democratic Party as the party of the worker, which will change when Ronald Reagan becomes president, a Republican. He will switch that back to the Republican Party, and it's kind of stayed since. I put Frances Perkins down here. Frances Perkins, the first woman ever appointed to the president's cabinet. She was appointed the Secretary of Labor. She's the one that helped to put together the Social Security Act for for Franklin Roosevelt. Very interesting history for Frances Perkins. She was a teacher, probably why I really like her. New York City, there's going to be this massive fire in 1911 called the Triangular Shirtwaist Factory fire. A factory catches on fire. All women work there. The majority of them are immigrant women. And they were like in the 4th and 5th and 6th floor. The fire took place. There was no way for them to get out. Many of the women died in that fire. Now, she was a school teacher and witnessed this. And she became very upset that nobody cared about women's rights nor immigrant rights. Also, the unsafe working conditions that people worked in. Turns out she becomes a friend of Theodore Roosevelt, and Theodore Roosevelt encouraged her to pursue a career in public safety, which she became the public safety director of New York City, and eventually for the entire state of New York. And then later on, Theodore Roosevelt's cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, will appoint her to the Secretary of Labor. The first woman, again, to sit on the president's cabinet is Frances Perkins. So I'm going to leave it there. I know this went a little long, but again, you can watch this at 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, and then come back and finish it. Be looking for the video log that I'll put up a little bit later. And yeah, have a good evening. See you whenever I see you. Bye-bye.